This is the story of a failure. Not just the failure of a city to protect its most vulnerable, but the failure of a legend to uphold his name. We all know the legend, Eliot Ness, the man who took down Al Capone, the unwavering symbol of law and order, fearlessly battling the mob, earning the immortal moniker, the Untouchables. He was the clean-cut hero who marched into Chicago and emerged victorious. But after Chicago, Ness moved to Cleveland, Ohio, where he took the highly influential position of the Director of Public Safety. Here, in the shadows of the Great Depression, he was expected to clean up a city ravaged by poverty, corruption, and vice. He was the city's shining promise. Yet, in Cleveland, Ness met a monster more elusive, more clinical, and arguably more terrifying than the entire Capone syndicate combined. This monster was not a gangster or a bootlegger. He was a phantom, an anatomical ghost who left behind a terrifying trail of dismembered human remains. This is the case of the Cleveland torso murderer, often called the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The defining tragedy of this case is not merely the violence, but the paradox. Ness, the legend, the ultimate crime fighter, was responsible for the investigation that, despite all his resources, resulted in no arrest, no conviction, and no formal identification of the killer. The murders stopped, but the killer seemingly vanished, walking free into history. To understand this catastrophic failure, we must first understand the stage upon which this horror was set, Cleveland in the 1930s. The Great Depression had reshaped the American landscape. Cleveland, once a vibrant industrial hub, became a landscape of desperate destitution. The social contract had collapsed, and in the heart of this collapse lay a winding, forgotten ravine known as Kingsbury Run. This was a no-man's land, a vast, desolate stretch of railway yards, derelict factories, and the muddy, winding flow of the Cuyahoga River. It was the absolute bottom of the social ladder, a sprawling shantytown known locally as the Hobo Jungle, or the Valley of the Tramps. Hundreds of the homeless, the desperate, the unemployed, and the addicted lived here, often in self-made shacks cobbled together from scrap wood and sheet metal. These individuals were the invisible population. They had no bank accounts, no fixed addresses, and often no family left to claim them. Their disappearance would register, at best, as a minor footnote in the chaos of the decade. They were the perfect disposable victims. The official tally of the torso murders spans from September 1935 to August 1938, covering the heart of Ness's tenure in Cleveland. But some researchers believe the killer started as early as 1934, with an unconfirmed victim found near the area. The pattern began with chilling clarity on September 23, 1935. Two teenagers playing in the run stumbled upon a discovery that would haunt the city for years. Hidden beneath a cluster of brush were the nude torsos of two men. Both victims had been brutally decapitated, their bodies meticulously cleaned and drained of blood. The heads were, chillingly, nowhere to be found. This discovery did not shock the police, not immediately. In the depths of the Depression, violence against the indigent was sadly common. But the clinical precision of the dismemberment, that was different. It spoke not of a crime of passion or a drunken brawl, but of a calculated, ritualistic, and highly skilled perpetrator. Over the next 3 years, the killer refined their terrifying craft. The victims were a mix of men and women, all members of that invisible population of Kingsbury Run. They were poor, marginalized, and almost impossible to identify. The second victim, found in late September, was the body of an unidentified woman, later dubbed the Lady of the Lake. She was found equally dismembered, washed up near the shores of Lake Erie. The fear began to spread, not among the city's elite, but through the already broken community of the Run. They knew something was hunting them, yet they had nowhere else to go. They lived in fear of the shadows, knowing that for this killer they were utterly expendable. Eliot Ness was now dealing with a nightmare. It wasn't the predictable structure of the mob, but a lone wolf operating with surgical cunning. The city of Cleveland now depended on the untouchable, the legendary crime fighter, to solve a series of crimes that had never been seen before in American history. But the killer had a terrifying advantage: the anonymity and the absolute despair of his victims. The official victim count for the Cleveland torso murderer is 12, but forensic experts and researchers believe the true number could be as high as 20. The victims included 7 men and 5 women. Only 2 victims, Edward Andrassy and Florence Polillo, were ever positively identified through fingerprints. The rest were designated John and Jane Does, their names forever lost to the Great Depression and the killer's macabre efficiency. The terror of this case lies in the method of operation, the MO. It was not the random hacking of a madman. It was clinical, practiced, and deeply disturbing. Dr. Samuel Gerber, the county coroner, was the man tasked with piecing together the broken remnants of the victims. What he found was unprecedented. The dismemberment was performed with what he could only describe as surgical precision. The killer meticulously cut the bodies at the joints, the elbows, shoulders, hips, and knees. This required detailed knowledge of human anatomy, of where the bones meet, and how the ligaments and tendons hold them together. It was the work of someone with training. More horrifyingly, the killer methodically drained the bodies of blood. The skin often appeared hardened or tanned, indicating that the bodies had been treated with a chemical solution, or perhaps just lime, in an attempt to hinder decomposition and confound the investigators. The heads were always, without exception, severed with great force and never recovered from the immediate area. This was the killer's ultimate measure of control. Without a head, identification via dental records or facial features was impossible. By targeting the most vulnerable population and simultaneously removing the key to their identity, the killer ensured the victims remained anonymous ghosts. The case of the tattooed man, victim number 3, perfectly illustrates the frustration. Found in the Run in July 1936, this victim was distinguished by 6 distinctive tattoos on his body, including the names Helen and Paul and various military emblems. In a desperate, highly controversial move, Eliot Ness himself authorized a massive public campaign. A plaster cast of the victim's head was created, and enlarged photographs of the unique tattoos were displayed at the Great Lakes Exposition, a World's Fair event drawing millions of visitors. Over 100,000 people stood in line to view these macabre exhibits. Yet, not a single person came forward to positively identify the man. A witness claimed to recognize the body as one Edward W. Andrassy, but the identification was never officially confirmed. The fact that a man with such unique, identifying markings could remain unclaimed speaks volumes about the isolation and expendability of the people living in Kingsbury Run. The sheer difficulty of the investigation was compounded by the geography. Kingsbury Run was a labyrinth of tracks and tunnels, a dumping ground accessible by rail and by water, making it nearly impossible to trace the killer's movements or pinpoint the exact scene of the murders. The bodies were often washed clean by the river or heavily decomposed by the time they were found. The killer was always many steps ahead. The MO was also inconsistent in one crucial way: the condition of the bodies. While all were decapitated and dismembered, some showed signs of chemical treatment, others were found stuffed into sacks, and some bore evidence of severe blunt force trauma before death. This led some investigators to theorize that there might be two killers, or that the killer was experimenting with his methods, becoming more clinical and more proficient with each subsequent victim. The discovery of two new victims in the summer of 1937 ramped up the pressure on Ness. One, identified as Florence Polillo, was the only victim found outside of Kingsbury Run who was subsequently identified. She was a waitress and a known figure in the seedy underworld of Cleveland. Her identification led the police to a man named Frank Dolezal. Dolezal was an itinerant construction worker who had been in a relationship with Polillo. He was arrested and subjected to intense interrogation. After days in police custody, the police announced that Dolezal had confessed to the murders of Polillo and Andresi. Dolezal even signed a confession. However, the confession was riddled with factual errors that proved the police, under pressure from Ness, had coerced it. Dolezal later recanted the entire confession, claiming he was tortured and beaten into signing. He maintained his innocence until his death. And here we find the first major crack in the untouchable facade of Eliot Ness. The pressure for an arrest was so immense that his police force was willing to use brutality and coercion to close the case, targeting an easy, expendable suspect, a transient, just like the victims. The Dolezal confession was the first major lie in the case, a lie that would ultimately fail to hold up in court. And unfortunately for Ness, the killer was far from finished. The failure to secure a conviction for Frank Dolezal was a public relations disaster for Eliot Ness. The city had believed its hero. Now, they suspected he had overseen a police force more concerned with a quick fix than true justice. Despite the skepticism, Ness continued to pour resources into the investigation, utilizing new forensic methods and bringing in outside specialists. He was obsessed with ending the reign of the torso murderer, which threatened to eclipse his own legendary career. The press, initially supportive, began to question whether the former G-Man was out of his depth against a killer who defied all conventional methods of investigation. Ness's most critical period came in the summer of 1938. The killer, sensing the renewed police interest, took the ultimate step in brazenness. On August 16, 1938, the police received a tip-off about a collection of remains found beneath a bridge near the Cuyahoga River. When investigators arrived, they were horrified. The remains belonged to two unidentified women who had clearly been killed and dismembered only hours earlier. But the killer had done more than just dispose of the bodies. In a direct challenge to the authority of the law, the killer had arranged the remains in a way that ensured they would be immediately visible. It was a spectacular display of arrogance and contempt, a clear message to Ness that the killer was still operating, unconcerned by the scrutiny. This act was the breaking point. Ness recognized that the killer was using the vast, anonymous landscape of Kingsbury Run as his shield and his hunting ground. The only way to stop the murders, he concluded, was to destroy the environment that enabled them. In a move that remains the most controversial of his career in Cleveland, Eliot Ness ordered a complete and utter destruction of Kingsbury Run. On August 18, 1938, police and firemen descended upon the shanty towns. With searchlights blazing and torches lit, they systematically burned every single shack, hut, and dwelling in the run to the ground. Ness watched from a vantage point as the entire hobo jungle went up in smoke, chasing out hundreds of transients, the potential victims and the only witnesses, into the surrounding areas. The destruction was condemned by civil liberties groups as brutal and unconstitutional. But from a purely pragmatic standpoint, the order was devastatingly effective. The murders immediately stopped. The torso murderer never claimed another official victim in Cleveland after the fire. Ness had defeated the killer, not by catching him, but by destroying his environment and eliminating his preferred prey pool. It was a victory of scorched earth policy over conventional police work. However, the investigation could not stop there. The case needed a suspect, a name, to bring closure. The focus soon shifted to the individual who, for decades, has been the most compelling and terrifying possibility. He was known to investigators as Dr. X. The key to understanding Dr. X was in the anatomical precision of the cuts, the obvious knowledge of human musculature and bone structure. The killer was likely a professional, perhaps one who had practiced surgery in a high-stress environment. This brought investigators to Francis E. Sweeney. Sweeney was an intriguing and deeply disturbing figure. He was a war veteran who had served in a medical unit during World War I, where he had extensive experience performing field amputations and surgeries. Following the war, he returned with severe psychological trauma and became an alcoholic, often descending into periods of violence and depression. Sweeney was also a relative of a prominent Cleveland politician, a fact that would become highly relevant to Ness's handling of the case. Critically, Sweeney had worked in hospitals near Kingsbury Run and was confirmed to have lived in the area during the time of the murders. The evidence against Sweeney was circumstantial but highly compelling. He was a professional with the required anatomical knowledge. He fit the psychological profile, a man spiraling into delusion and violence after suffering severe trauma. And his behavior became erratic following the later murders. Ness, convinced they had their man, personally oversaw Sweeney's interrogation. In a series of intense, face-to-face interrogations, Eliot Ness pressed Francis E. Sweeney relentlessly. Sweeney was never formally arrested or charged. The reason remains one of the central mysteries of the case and a black mark on Ness's record. Sweeney, a highly intelligent and educated man, passed a highly rudimentary lie detector test. This result, however, was later deemed unreliable due to the primitive nature of the technology at the time and Sweeney's own reported psychological instability. The common, accepted theory among true crime historians and former investigators is that Ness knew Sweeney was the killer, but faced an insurmountable political roadblock. Because of Sweeney's powerful family connections, arresting him would have triggered a massive legal and political battle that Ness, already under fire for the Dolezal failure and the Shantytown fire, could not afford to fight. The compromise, it is believed, was a quiet, non-prosecutorial agreement. Soon after the interrogations, Francis E. Sweeney was voluntarily committed to a government-run psychiatric hospital for treatment. He would spend the remainder of his life institutionalized, dying in 1964. Crucially, the killings did not resume after Sweeney's institutionalization. For many, this is the final, compelling proof. Ness had traded a public arrest and trial for immediate public safety. He had prioritized stopping the murder spree over achieving absolute justice, a chilling reversal for the man who once fought for absolute rule of law against Al Capone. But the failure to prosecute Sweeney had a profound consequence. It denied the victims justice, and it allowed the killer's name to be scrubbed from the historical record. The case remained cold, officially unsolved, despite the widespread suspicion surrounding Sweeney. Decades later, forensic investigators and historians have returned to the case with modern scrutiny. Could Sweeney be definitively named the torso murderer? One of the most chilling pieces of circumstantial evidence came from Sweeney himself. Even while institutionalized, he was known to send highly disturbing, anonymous postcards to Ness and other key investigators. The cards were signed with variations of his wartime unit number and were often menacing, taunting the investigators and hinting at his involvement in the horrific crimes. These notes only solidified Ness's private conviction that he had found the right man. Furthermore, Sweeney's medical history indicated that he possessed the perfect, devastating trifecta for the killer's profile: anatomical knowledge, a documented descent into alcoholism and violence, and proximity to the victims. In the end, Ness managed to eliminate the threat, but at the cost of his own moral high ground. He defeated the murderer by burning down the run and forcing the suspect into an institution, but he could never deliver the final, official justice that the victims, few as they were, deserved. Nearly a century has passed since the bodies first appeared in Kingsbury Run, and the case of the torso murderer remains a painful, open wound in the history of Cleveland. The mystery of the killer's identity is compounded by the larger, enduring tragedy: the anonymity of the victims. The vast majority of the 12 official victims are still unidentified. They are known only by the designation given to them by Dr. Gerber and the police: Kingsbury Run Doe or Jane Doe of the Lake. This anonymity is the killer's final victory. However, in the last decade, a silent, powerful movement has begun to fight back against this historical erasure, using the very technologies that Eliot Ness could only have dreamed of. Modern forensic investigators and genealogical experts are making a renewed push for identification. The goal is no longer necessarily to prosecute the killer, who is long dead, but to restore the names of the victims. This effort is led, in part, by organizations like the DNA Doe Project and dedicated genealogical researchers. The process involves exhuming the remains of the John and Jane Does, many of whom were buried in unmarked graves, and extracting viable DNA samples. These samples are then uploaded to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. By building out family trees based on distant genetic relatives, researchers can work backward through decades of records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and census data to slowly narrow down the possibilities and put a name to the bones. The work is agonizingly slow and expensive, but the motivation is clear: to honor the dignity that the killer ruthlessly stole from them. To finally give them a name, a grave marker, and a final permanent identity outside of the phrase Kingsbury Run victim. The investigation into the killer's identity has also seen a recent modern resurgence. Forensic science has confirmed that all available evidence points back to a single killer with anatomical knowledge, largely reinforcing the decades-old suspicion surrounding Francis E. Sweeney. But beyond Sweeney, other theories persist. One theory suggests the involvement of a different medical professional, a doctor from the east side of Cleveland, who had ties to the area and also fit the profile. Another theory posits that the murders continued outside of Kingsbury Run, possibly stretching into the 1940s, with victims found in neighboring states that were never officially linked to the Cleveland case. Ultimately, the true legacy of the Cleveland torso murders is a moral one. It shines a stark, unforgiving light on how society treats its most marginalized populations. These people were considered less than human, disposable. They could be murdered, dismembered, and their disappearance ignored by the vast majority of the city. The failure of Eliot Ness to officially solve the case is a symbol of a broader systemic failure. A failure rooted in the dehumanization of the poor during the bleakest chapter of American economic history. The killer's impunity was founded on the world's indifference to his victims. While the name of the killer may forever be shrouded in the political machinations of the 1930s, the fight to identify the John and Jane Does of Kingsbury Run continues. It is a quiet, persistent effort to ensure that the tragic lives that ended in the shadows of the run are finally remembered not as body parts, but as people who were once loved and who finally deserved to be brought home.